This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News at the People's Climate March in Washington. I have the privilege of being joined today by Alex Doukas, a senior campaigner from Oil Change International. Thank you very much for joining us today, Alex.
Thank you, Dimitri. Good to see you.
So we talked at COP21 in Paris in December of 2015, and we focused during our interview on the fossil fuel subsidies, particularly in Western states, and including in particularly Canada. Now we're about 18 months beyond the Paris Accord. Could you give us sort of a general report card on where countries like Canada, the United States, the EU stand in terms of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen in the G7 group of nations, so 7 of the big wealthy industrialized economies have come out and said that they want to end all fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, which is a major commitment. It's obviously pretty late. We shouldn't be paying money to polluters through 2025. We'd like to see an end date closer to 2020, but at least there's an international commitment on the table for the phase-out deadline for subsidies. The G20, which includes a lot of other countries, big major emitters, hasn't come to the same agreement, unfortunately. We're still hoping for action from them. But in broad international agreement terms, we've made some progress, but it's nowhere near enough. I mean, we can't keep funding polluters to pollute if we're going to solve climate change and meet the Paris climate goals that were agreed in 2015, and we're nowhere close to doing that yet.
And in Canada particularly, what's the performance of the Trudeau government in regard to fossil fuel subsidies to date?
Well, for a long time, they didn't give any indication about whether they were planning to deliver on their campaign platform promise to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies in line with a commitment that they'd made at the G20. But in 2017, just in March, in their latest budget, they actually did scale back subsidies to oil and gas companies a little bit. So it's not what we need to see from them. It's not the end of the picture, but it's a really, really encouraging step. There's much, much more that the Trudeau government can do, especially because these subsidies to oil and gas companies will undermine their plans to introduce a national floor on the carbon price. Basically, you've got these subsidies still pulling in the opposite direction. So a good first step in this budget that I was frankly a little surprised by, pleasantly, but a lot more to do, and it's not nearly enough action nearly quickly enough, especially when they're promoting pipelines and additional extraction in the tar sands, which is something that's completely incompatible with climate limits.
And are you able to quantify it in percentage terms? If they move forward with their budget proposal, by what percentage would they be decreasing fossil fuel subsidies at the federal government level?
It's difficult to say exactly because we actually don't agree with the government on the methodology to calculate what the subsidies are in the first place. So trying to determine how much that reduction is a bit difficult in percentage terms. In absolute terms, the government's own estimate is about $50 million-ish, starting in 2018 through 2020. So I think it's a good start, but it's tiny compared to the total amount of subsidies that still persist in Canada for oil and gas. And again, these are big companies, rich executives. Why should we be giving them handouts? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
And let's talk more broadly about compliance with the emission reduction targets that were agreed to in Paris. And just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to ask you to focus on the major emitters. Are they, in your opinion, on a path to achieve their emission reduction targets, which I think are broadly understood by the scientific community to be quite inadequate? If they meet them, we're talking about global warming in the range of, I think, about 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But let's put that aside and just talk about those emission reduction targets. Are the major emitters on a path to actually achieving those targets at this stage?
We're not seeing that yet. And that's a big concern because we have to start bending that emissions curve before 2020 if we have a hope of actually meeting those targets, because the longer we delay action, the harder it gets, the more expensive it gets. Right now, there's a lot of benefit to moving to clean energy economy, huge investment opportunity, but the longer we wait, the more difficult that transition becomes to do quickly enough to limit emissions to where we need to be to stay within those scientific boundaries and the political boundaries that were agreed in the Paris Agreement. So we haven't seen enough ambition yet from the European Union, although a lot of the European countries are starting to make good progress. They're still thinking about natural gas as a big bridge fuel and trying to expand public investment and public finance for natural gas, which is a form of subsidy, into new natural gas pipelines. Doesn't make any sense if they're going to meet their climate targets. And so we need to see more action there. In the U.S., completely not on track to meet our emissions targets, even if the Clean Power Plan were implemented, which is something that's under threat by Donald Trump. There's a lot of state-level work that could be done to try and plug the gap there, but we need to act quickly. Canada's another case that I wanted to talk about just because we do a lot of work in that context. They're not at the level of ambition where they need to be to meet even their as you noted, already extremely inadequate climate target, which is the same as the Harper era climate target. We don't even have a credible pathway to meet Harper's climate targets, which the Trudeau government didn't change. They just carried them over. And that tells us a lot about how much more Canada needs to do as a rich country, as a relatively wealthy country, to do its fair share on climate action.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Alex, and I hope you've had an excellent march today, and thank you for talking to us.
You had a great time here, too, and thanks for being here. It's a great march, as you can see.
Absolutely. So.